You duped me, O Lord, and I let myself be duped. I love that line. Maybe you felt like that at sometimes. Jeremiah is in a very difficult position. He's called to be a prophet at a particularly wicked time in Israel's history. Jerusalem's going to fall, the temple's going to be destroyed, and people just don't want to hear about it. And so they make fun of him, they laugh at him, they mock him, they imprison him, they stone him. And through it all, while he wishes he could keep his mouth shut, he can't. It burns within him the word of God, and he must speak. It's his vocation of suffering. I can remember 29 years ago, I was in the seminary, my second year of theology, and as the seminary would often do, they invited in a preacher for a retreat for us, and he was excellent. He was a wonderful preacher, a wonderful retreat master. And during the retreat, he was offering hours for spiritual direction to the seminary. And so I signed up for one of those hours, and I went to see him, and we talked about my prayer life and where I was spiritually, and it was very beneficial, very helpful. At the end of our time together, he looked at me and he said, "Lee, I'm going to pray for you." And I thanked him. I love when people promise to pray for me. I mean, I live on the prayers of the people. And so he said, "I'm going to pray for you." And I said, "Thank you very much." He says, "I'm going to pray in specific that in your life you have great, great suffering." What? I mean, I like this guy. I didn't want to say anything mean to him. I don't say, no, don't. But it's been this prayer that's been offered for me that I've often thought about it and I've often wondered about. Steve, I'm going to pray that you have great suffering. Okay. Yeah. It's nice, John. You got my prayers. I pray that your life is filled with... Can you imagine that? And yet that's precisely what the gospel speaks of today. The mystery, the paradox of suffering and the cross. The relationship between discipleship and suffering and the cross. The context of today's gospel passage is that they're in the region of Caesarea Philippi. And Jesus asks them, and who do you say that I am? And Peter steps forward on behalf of the 12, and he says, "You are the Christ, the Messiah, the promised one. And you are the Son of God." It's at this very moment when Peter, on behalf of the 12, declares that Jesus is divine, that he is God, that Jesus then tells them what's going to happen. God tells them what's about to happen. The Son of Man is going to go to Jerusalem and suffer greatly at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and rise on the third day. And so what does impetuous Peter do? Pulls Jesus aside and says, No. God, this is not going to happen to you. I don't want this can't be. And Jesus says, "Behind me, Satan, you are an obstacle to me." Think about it for a moment. Peter has just proclaimed that Jesus is God. And then he tells God that you can't do it this way. Jesus goes from giving Simon a new name, Peter, the rock, upon which I'm going to build my church. And in today's gospel, he gives him a second name, Satan, who's is an obstacle, the adversary, the enemy of God's people, and that he's being a stumbling block. That's the actual Greek word that Jesus is using, the word scandalon, which means a stumbling stone. So he keeps Peter's name as a rock, but now he's no longer a rock that is a foundation, but now he's a rock that's a stumbling block to God's plan, because that's what Peter is doing. He's saying, no, you can't save us this way. And it is precisely through suffering and the cross that God will set us free. That was his plan, to come into the world and lay down his life for us. And so, like Peter, maybe we want to say, no, we don't want this suffering. Jesus is very clear. In contemporary Christianity, when we think of ourselves as Christians, we think of ourselves as believers. We believe what Jesus teaches. We believe that he's the Son of God. We believe he's the Savior of the world. We believe his teachings, the doctrines that are passed down to us that we must follow. And while the apostles were also believers, what's more important is that they are disciples, students, followers of Christ. As disciples, they must imitate the Master, and they must follow the Master, for he is the way and the truth and the life. They must follow him. If you wish to follow me, you must deny yourself, Jesus says. Embrace the cross and come after me. Jesus leads us to Jerusalem, to Calvary, and to the resurrection. To the resurrection. That's what he wants us to focus on. Our natural desire is to save our life. If you wish to save your life, Jesus says, and this is paradoxical for a disciple, if you wish to save your life, you must lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, you will find it. He's trying to counter out our natural desire. We are not to be conformed to the natural desires of the world around us, but we are to be conformed to Christ. As St. Paul says, we must make a spiritual offering ourselves. We are to embrace sacrifice and suffering. Our natural desire to want to gain the whole world like those around us, to have all the security of the things around us. And Jesus says, what profit is it to you if you gain the whole world and lose your life in the process? The Greek word is psyche, the word for psychology. And while it can mean life, it literally translates into soul. What profit is it for you to gain the whole world and to lose your soul in the process? He's challenging us to see things differently, to see things in light of the fact that there will be a judgment. And he finishes today's sayings by reminding us that each of us will be judged according to our acts, to whether we truly follow him to Jerusalem, Calvary, so that we might share in his resurrection. This is a difficult teaching for us. It's the paradox of being a disciple of Christ. We are different. People don't want to hear about our way of life because it involves embracing sacrifice and suffering. When Jesus tells his disciples, you must embrace the cross, he's not speaking metaphorically. For those original apostles, they only heard that they must embrace this horrific form of execution that was heinous and shameful if they were to be his disciples. And they did. Jesus takes this moment with Peter to open up the mystery of suffering for us. And yet most of us, I have to include myself, would rather listen to the televangelists who tell us about the gospel of prosperity. Short on money, just send some in. You'll have all kinds of riches. Say this prayer, and all the bad stuff will go away. You'll have an easy life. That's nice words to hear, but when we open the scriptures, when we look at the words of Christ, that's not what we find. He's challenging us to pick up our cross and follow after him. And that's difficult. We think. St. Augustine ties this passage in his meditation on Matthew 16 with Jesus' words, "Come to me, all you who are weary and find life burdensome, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you, for it is easy, and my burden is light." What the world thinks as being impossible is not impossible. It's not impossible if we do it in communion with Christ. That's what that saying of Jesus means. Come to me, I will walk with you. You will not carry this burden alone. Embrace the cross and I will be there for you. And it will be easy. It will be light. God will not give us any cross that is too much to bear. St. Jose Maria Escrivá, a modern 20th century saint, in meditating on the way of the cross, reminds us that we should embrace the cross with love as Jesus embraced the cross for our salvation with love. That we should embrace the cross with apprehension. For that is not very generous. But rather we should embrace the cross with love. And if we embrace the cross with love, then our cross will be a cross without a cross. St. Jose Maria says, that's a paradox. To embrace the cross with love is to carry a cross without a cross. We see this happening in our families. When we have a relative, a mother, a father, a brother or sister who loves us unconditionally, who makes huge sacrifices for us without even thinking about it, out of love. This is the love we are being called to. It is a fulfillment of Jesus' new command to love one another as Christ has loved us. To offer sacrifice, not just for our immediate family, but for our whole family, the people of God throughout the world, for everyone. Two practical points on this. First, don't be afraid of the cross. Live in communion with Christ, and he will carry the cross. He only asks that we walk with him, that we keep our eyes focused on him. Do not be afraid of the cross. It is through the cross that reconciliation takes place. And the second thing is to never become an obstacle, a scandal to our brothers and sisters by being an obstacle to God's plan for our salvation. As our Catechism question of the week quotes one of the great saints in the church, says that the cross is the only ladder that leads to heaven. Let us not be a stumbling block to the suffering and the sacrifice of those around us. Like Peter, we don't want to see our loved ones suffer. But we can start thinking like man rather than God. We can say to a brother and sister, shouldn't be married to this person. They don't love you enough. You're always giving, 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 and you get nothing in return. Stop. Do something for yourself. Even though they promised in the eyes of God and in the presence of the church, I will love you in good times and in bad, in sickness and health, all the days of my life. We become an obstacle to their conformation to the love of Christ. We hear it all the time. Let your child go. They've betrayed you too many times. They've taken advantage of you. Cut them loose. Don't let them make you a doormat anymore. And yet, the only way we have communion with God and one another is for people like you who have been mistreated, who have been treated poorly, who have not been loved, to continue to love. That is the only way that we are reconciled to one another, is when those around us love us when we are unlovable. And believe me, all of us, myself included, all of us are unlovable at times. It's only when we're unlovable and someone loves us back to life, refuses to give up on us, loves us, and forgives us multiple times, countless times, endless times, that we begin to have our eyes open to the unconditional love of God in our midst. Through our mom, our dad, our brother, our sister, our friend, our co-worker, our neighbor. It's only when we make of our lives a spiritual sacrifice, when we absorb the hatred and the hurt, when we love when we are not loved, that we make God's love incarnate in our midst, and people are reconciled. This is the way to salvation, Jesus is telling us. Do not be an obstacle to one another. None of us want to see each other, our friends, our loved ones, being hurt. But our job as disciples of Christ is to walk with them, to shoulder with them the cross that they are carrying. It is a salvific cross, a cross that leads to healing and reconciliation. They will know you are my disciples by your love, by your unconditional love. How did those early disciples do it? Those first apostles, after they learned the lesson, as they vowed to follow their master to Jerusalem and Calvary and beyond, they did it because they were living in communion with Christ and his love. It is for this reason that we hear in the New Testament disciples like Stephen being stoned, praying for his persecutors. It is in this way that they counted themselves blessed to share in the sufferings of Christ. It is because they were living in the communion and the joy of the love of God that even in the worst of times, when they were being led to the slaughter, that they sang praises to God. They loved and embraced the cross. And their cross was a cross that no longer had a cross. We get those words from saints who speak about loving and praying to share in the sufferings of Christ. How could they do that if it isn't for love? And so, I'm not going to tell you what I'm praying for you guys. But I could tell you this. I am grateful that that spiritual master, that retreat leader, 29 years ago prayed for me that my life would be filled with suffering. And how sweet it is when we love as we have been loved.